Last time on Almost Fiction, we dove into the early lives of two men whose paths would eventually cross, leading to one of the most disturbing cases this show has ever covered. Charles Ng, born on Christmas Eve 1960 in Hong Kong, grew up under the strict and sometimes violent hand of his father Kenneth. Despite given every opportunity, Charlie rebelled, eventually finding himself expelled from school after a series of escalating incidents, including throwing Molotov cocktails at a playground. Shipped off to England and then America for school, Charlie's pattern of theft and violence continued until he forged his way into the US Marines using a fake identity. There he excelled in combat training but couldn't stay out of trouble, eventually orchestrating a robbery of his own base's armory before escaping custody and fleeing to California. That's where he met Leonard Lake, a former Marine with his own troubled past. Abandoned by his mother at an early age, Leonard grew up experimenting with animals and developing an obsession with medieval fantasy and survivalism. After a brief and turbulent military career that ended in a psychiatric discharge, Leonard drifted through life, moving from place to place, developing increasingly disturbing sexual proclivities and a fascination with photographing young women. When Charlie arrived at Lake's property in 1981, the two formed an immediate bond over their shared interests in weapons, survival skills, and violence. Together, they began a crime spree of robberies and sexual assaults before Charlie was finally caught and sent to Leavenworth Prison for 3 years. But this was just the beginning. What would happen later would become one of the most horrific chapters in American criminal history. In prison, Charlie wasted no time in plotting his revenge. He started to talk to just about anyone who had listened to him, and he would regale them with tales full of money, daring, and adventure, tales he wanted to turn into reality with the Brotherhood. Quote, "I thought he sounded like he knew his stuff, and if we could put a band together like a special forces group, we could make it work. But he went from just simple bank jobs to wanting to steal military missiles and shoot down 747s. John Carty was in Leavenworth for the theft of a Jeep, and at first, like he said in his own words, it all sounded rather fun and lucrative, but as Charlie continued his schemes and planned missions for the Brotherhood, they began to take on more of a terroristic feel. John still played along with Charlie as his plans grew even darker, but only because he was afraid of Charlie, afraid that if he disagreed now, he'd end up with a shiv in his side. He'd listened as Charlie had bragged about the things he had done, including, at least according to him, times when he would staple mice to wooden boards before running them through a table saw. Quote, "I tried to get him to concentrate on ways of making money, and his response was, 'Hey, if you're not into torture, that's okay. We'll do operations together and I'll do my own thing on the side.'" End quote. Plus, there was also Charlie's favorite slogan of, "No kill, no thrill." They were words he'd repeat ad nauseum, becoming almost his slogan, words that were half braggadocious and half threat. Charlie continued to openly fantasize about torture, especially to women during his time in jail, and nobody really said anything to him about it because he was actually quite good with his fists, despite his small size. Eventually, Charlie's fantasies began to grow even larger when he started talking about a secret bunker he wanted to build, a secret bunker that would be equipped with an arsenal, plenty of food, as well as holding cells for Charlie's future sex slaves. Finally, unable to take it any longer, John Carty went to the FBI because in his mind, Charlie was no longer fantasizing, no longer just speaking in hypotheticals, he was being serious. The FBI actually came out to the prison and they wanted John to work with them, spy on Charlie, but John wanted no part of it. And when he was released in 1984, he cut off all ties with the small man who wanted to see the world burn. Down a friend now, Charlie started to confide more in another inmate, a man by the name of Michael Carroll. Michael was from San Francisco and was planning on going back there when his time was up, and he was more than excited at the possibility of joining Charlie's little group. Charlie also brought in others into his group, mainly Michael Diaz, John Hudson, and Charles Dyer, with Dyer signing on to be the group's helicopter pilot. And Leonard, well, Leonard was still in the group, still one of the founding members, and using Leonard's half-sister and his wife Cricket, the pair was able to write letters to each other, letters that neither signed with their real names, letters that saw Leonard encouraging Charlie in his recruiting efforts. June 29, 1984. Charlie Ng walks out of prison a free man after finishing his sentence. One of the new members of the Brotherhood had already been released, and Charlie headed to Oklahoma in order to meet up with him and hopefully work a job where they would hit an armory so they could stock up on some real weapons. Charlie also had something else he wanted to do. He wanted to kill Ken Staff. Ken Staff had slighted Charlie, used him for protection in prison, and then after his release, had simply ghosted him. But Charlie just wasn't going to let it go. As soon as he had the guns and help of John Hudson, he was going to finally get even. Charlie caught up with John, but there was a problem. You see, John had a good job now, and he was finally able to spend time with his wife and kids, and, well, he just didn't want to risk all of that. But he also couldn't risk angering Charlie. He pretended to help Charlie, pretended to look for Ken's staff, but he made sure to avoid any area where they might actually run into the man. And, not finding him, Charlie instead wanted a quote hooker, end quote, that he could possibly rip off, rape, and even torture, but once again, John drove him around to multiple locations where he knew there would not be any sex workers. Finally, after the fruitless search, he could tell Charlie was getting angry, but John had already planned for this, and that's when he presented Charlie with a handgun, a military-issued .45 caliber pistol, and it did the trick. Charlie loved the gun and even nicknamed it Baby before mailing it to Cricket in San Francisco. Turns out he would even beat the gun to California, though it arrived only a day or two after him. He finally was back. Rewind. 18 months before Charlie would be back out of prison, Leonard Lake was still on the run from police. He didn't want to go to jail, didn't want to be locked up, so he skipped his court date and began to make plans to go into hiding. And though he still loved Cricket and still planned on being with her when he could, they eventually got divorced, but only so Cricket could not be pulled into the mess with him, and so they had a clear break, at least in the eyes of the law. Leonard then went on the run and was becoming increasingly unstable because he felt like all eyes were always on him, even though the reality of the situation was nobody was actively looking for him. He had a warrant out for his arrest, but there were no flyers going around, there was no picture of him in every precinct. In fact, he probably could walk right by an officer, and as long as he wasn't acting crazy, he could have just went on his way. But in his mind, he was like John Rambo, running from cops who were hell-bent on getting him, running from people who wanted him dead. He'd rented a basement suite in the city and was laying low, and to be honest, he was feeling low as well. He never wanted his life to end up like this, never wanted to be broke and on the run, but here he was, and he'd just have to pick himself up by the bootstraps and start over. It would all start with Donald. Donald was just a real pain in Leonard's ass, and that's why he'd done it. That's why he'd killed the man not too long before, because he was honestly doing the world a favor. And not wanting a good thing to go to waste, Leonard had actually impersonated Donald, wrote letters to Donald's mother, telling her that he had found a job working out of town, though it was a place with no phones. He'd then read the return letters, take and use the items that Donald's mother sent, including new socks and shirts, and even write back thanking her. But it wasn't just Donald's mother Leonard was scamming, it was also the government, because Leonard was still cashing Donald's unemployment checks, and he would continue to do so until they stopped coming. Leonard didn't feel guilty about what he was doing. Well, maybe he did a little, it was just hard lying to his mother the way he did. Because you see, Donald was Leonard's half-brother. And if their mother ever knew that Leonard had killed his own brother, well, half-brother, she would never forgive him. He didn't know why she loved Donald so much, that piece of trash, but she did, and maybe that's why he kept up the letter writing, and maybe it was just to help him to not get caught. Leonard knew that his scam was coming to an end, and he could only live off his brother's checks for a little while longer before he knew they would stop coming, so he had to find another mark. In the meantime, he continued to do petty crimes. He stole a lot, and whatever money he was able to earn seemed to disappear just as quickly due to the fact he could never stay away from sex workers, professional escorts, classified ad hookups, and even his ex-wife, Cricket. They were officially divorced but continued to sleep with each other, especially when Leonard gave her the promise of a gift. And other than stealing, working small odd jobs, and spending all his money on sex, Leonard was also a voracious reader, going through books almost as fast as he was going through women. It was around this time when he first read the book The Collector by John Fowles. He also loved the movie adaptation, a film about a timid butterfly collector in England who became overly obsessed with a young girl, to the point he built a dungeon of sorts for her before kidnapping her and keeping her as a slave. It was everything Leonard ever wanted. Someone he could use whenever he wanted and however he pleased. Pulling out pen and paper, he began to jot down ideas for Operation Miranda. He first needed some land, one with a house, as well as a hidden bunker. He decided it needed to be rural too, because it made discovery and escape harder, but the problem was that in order to buy land, you needed money, and Leonard was almost broke. He just needed to make some more, and that's when he had another idea. Charles Gunner. Charles Gunner was a friend of Leonard's, at least he used to be. In fact, Gunner had been his best man when he married Cricket, but lately he'd just been a disappointment. Gunner was splitting up with his wife Victoria, and he was also moving out, leaving their 2 children with their mom. He just didn't know what had come over the man. He was lazy, fat, and pretending to need government assistance. Gunnar was just weak now. Leonard pontificated over just how much he hated the man in his target book. Quote, "He sows not, nor does he labor. But how he reaps gold in the form of government handouts. Well, that will only last until his next trip up into the hill country. Charles won't be long for this life." End quote. Leonard then lured his old friend out to the nearby Sierra foothills using a cabin getaway as bait. Gunnar actually went with Leonard, making the 150-mile trip out to Calaveras County, where Crickett's family owned property, but when they arrived, Leonard realized that his plan wasn't going to work. He had already dug a grave, but realized that it was too far away from where they were and that there was no way he'd be able to move a 300-plus-pound dead man by himself. So, he called off the hit and replanned, dug another hole closer this time, and even acquired a winch. He then tried poisoning Gunnar using cyanide, something he kept around for himself because according to his journal, he would never be taken alive by police. He dosed his friend's food with the poison, but it didn't work. It really only made the men sick, but even that was a stretch. Leonard had failed. Not long after, Leonard actually moved in with Gunnar, who now shared custody of his children with his wife. Leonard played the part of dutiful uncle and played with the kids, cooked for them, fixed their bikes, cleaned up after them, and even took care of the yard. Meanwhile, Gunnar did absolutely nothing. Leonard was losing his patience after only a few months, and now that he lived with his friend, he could see that the man was an even bigger piece of trash than Leonard thought. He hid his own kids. Now, Leonard wasn't averse to corporal punishment. He'd been known to use it himself on his exes, but kids? That's where he drew the line. Convincing Gunnar to go out with him just one more time, Leonard took no chances and unloaded 2 handguns into his friend, pulling the triggers on the 22 and 38 until they ran dry. Then, using block and tackle, he moved the man to a pre-dug grave, and when he was done burying him, he even poured a slab of concrete on top of the body. It was finally over. Leonard spent the next month working on his next plan. He had Gunnar's assistance checks sent to his P.O. box and even paid Gunnar's outstanding bills before beginning to sell off all of Gunnar's earthly possessions. Nobody really questioned him about any of it. Nobody was surprised when he said Gunnar had run off, and nobody questioned him when he gave Gunnar's kids to their godparents, their mother not wanting them anymore. Everything went smooth. He was making decent money now, had 4 figures in his account for the first time in a long time, money he spent on, you guessed it, sex and guns. He also purchased some things to start Project Miranda, including drums that he would use to hide things on Crickett's property, like his stolen identities, including his half-brother Donald's and even his own. From now on, he would become Charles Gunnar, at least on paper. Realizing his plan was finally coming together now, Leonard doubled down on his money-making ideas, committing more thefts, and even went back to Greenfield Ranch, the commune near Ukiah, where he would often steal the marijuana they were growing before taking it to the city and selling it. He then asked if he could officially move into Crickett's cabin in Wiselyville, and she wasn't too thrilled with the idea, but he told her it was going to be okay. He then bought a new puppy, a German Shepherd he named Wubon, and taking the dog, he made the trek back out to hill country. July 9th, 1984. Cricket was waiting at the airport when Charlie got off the plane. She drove him to Leonard's place, the small apartment he still had in the city, and the 2 friends reunited like they were long-lost brothers. Leonard almost immediately began to tell Charlie of the bunker he'd been building over the past few months, told him that it was almost done, how he dug out the side of a hill before building the bunker with cinder blocks. It even had electricity now too, Leonard having done all the wiring himself. They talked for a long time before Charlie left, Leonard having found him a place to stay while he got back on his feet. They hung out all day the next day, and it was clear that both of them were excited to finally be working on Project Miranda. Soon they would have their own secret base, their own slaves, their own little kingdom. Leonard then told Charlie about a hit he had planned, a job where they could make some real money. He then explained about one of his times during his perusal of the classified ads, he'd found an ad for a gay man, one who was offering free blowjobs and free porn to straight men. He then told Charlie how Leonard himself had actually used his services, though he made sure to let Charlie know he didn't reciprocate the act. He then said these types usually had money and usually were easy targets, but Charlie, well, he was nervous. You see, despite his bravado and claims to have already killed, despite him constantly saying the phrase no kill, no thrill, he had actually never killed anyone before. Leonard, who had at least 2 murders under his belt, was shocked and angry, accusing Charlie of just riding his coattails, but after the berating, Charlie said that he was in. July 10th, 1984. 31-year-old Richard Carrazza was eating dinner in the kitchen of his apartment he shared with 37-year-old Donald Guetti. At around 7 p.m., David got up to answer a knock at the door, and Richard, hearing a commotion, went to go investigate. Coming around a corner, he saw a small Asian man going through some drawers, and when the man saw Richard, he panicked, and raising a gun, he began to fire as fast as he could pull the trigger. Richard collapsed to the floor as one of the rounds hit him directly in the chest. He was hurt, though the adrenaline was helping, and he laid there motionless as the 2 intruders fled. As soon as he knew they were gone, Richard was able to drag himself to the phone where he called police. David was also still alive when ambulance crews arrived, but sadly he would pass away later in the hospital, but Richard would survive. Before Charlie could get out of prison and before he had even started to build his bunker, Leonard made a videotape. He loved electronics and cameras and video recorders and used them quite a bit, making his own adult content, usually with Cricket, but he also used his recording devices to document his project. One evening, he set up his video camera on a tripod and, sitting across from it in an armchair, he began to describe his plan for Project Miranda. Quote, "The purpose of that cell, and the main purpose, hence of the building, will be imprisonment of a young lady. I want to be able to use a woman whenever and how I want, and when I am tired or satiated or bored, whenever and however, I simply want to put her away. I'm a realist. I am 38 years old, a bit chubby, not with much hair, and I'm losing what I have. I am not particularly attractive to women, or should I say particularly attracting to women, and all of the traditional magnets, money, power, I don't have. Yet, I am still very attracted to a particular type of woman who almost by definition is totally uninterested in me. I can create a facility that is so stark, so empty, so cold, so quiet, so totally removed from the world that by a combination of painful punishments and minor rewards, such as music or magazines, I can quickly condition a young woman to cooperate with me fully. This is my belief. Tomorrow evening, a backhoe will arrive and I will start excavating the earth. It will be interesting to see how far this tape and I actually go." End quote. July 25th, 1984. Deborah Ann Dubbs was busy planning the family's annual vacation to Lake Tahoe. She had been talking to Karen Tuck, whose own family was going as well, a tradition running back for a while now. Debbie and Karen had been friends since childhood, and that friendship had continued through marriages and now children. In fact, when Debbie was in a coma for 3 days from an illness, it was Karen who sat by her every day and talked to her to let her know she was not alone. Debbie was an only child, and Karen was more sister than friend, and they were looking forward to the trip that they did every year. Harvey Dubbs was Debbie's husband, and the typesetter wanted to figure a way to earn more money, so being enchanted with the new idea of home movies, he bought camera equipment and was thinking of renting himself out as a videographer, but if they wanted to do it themselves, he'd still be more than happy to rent them his equipment for events like weddings, birthday parties, and more. Debbie was telling Karen about the new plans and that they even already had their first client, a man who would be stopping by later that day to rent the equipment. In fact, that might be him at the door, so Debbie said goodbye to Karen before hanging up and going to talk to their first ever customer. The following day, Harvey Dubbs failed to show up for work. Everyone was starting to get worried until that is Lauren Bradbury, the print shop secretary, answered a call from a man named James Bright, who claimed that Harvey and his family had to make an emergency trip to Washington State to deal with a family matter. Harvey's boss, Stan Pedrov, was concerned about the news. He liked Harvey, considered him a friend, so he went out of his way to make sure that everything was okay. He was just confused. Harvey had his personal number and they often spoke after hours, so why hadn't he just called himself? Plus, he never heard of anyone by the name of James Bright. He made some calls. Eventually, after multiple dead ends, Karen was contacted and she sent her husband George over to check on their friends. He arrived shortly afterwards to find the key in the front door lock. Pushing the door open, he called out, but nobody answered. He carefully checked the home, making sure not to touch anything, before locking the door behind himself and keeping the key. Calling Debbie's father, Jim Norse, George told him what he'd found, and Jim immediately called the police. Jim then met officers at his daughter's home, and what he saw inside terrified him. There were dirty dishes in the sink and even a dirty diaper sitting on a dresser. He already knew something had happened because he knew his daughter and she would never have left the house like that, unless there was a serious emergency. Soon, a more detailed look through the house was ordered by detectives, and it was discovered that items were missing from the home. Harvey had been an obsessive when it came to his electronics, and had pictures and lists of everything he owned, and even had a list of serial numbers as well. It appeared as if his stereo equipment was gone, as was his recording equipment, as well as several cassette tapes and videos. When the neighbors were questioned, the detectives assigned to the case seemed to get the same story. People had seen two men on numerous occasions, one of them possibly Asian, removing items from the home before placing the items in the back of a white Honda. In fact, concerned for her neighbors, one person even followed the car, but when they spotted her, they were able to get away, driving recklessly through traffic. The disappearance of the Dubb family would eventually make the news, but other than the two men seen taking items from the home, there was no other information. Life moved on. Autumn 1984. The Pink Palace wasn't actually a palace, and in fact, it wasn't even pink, it was green. The popular flophouse on Carl Street in San Francisco's Hyatt-Ashbury district was a 30-unit building that usually saw a high turnover of tenants, but lately, it had been even worse. There had also been a new guy hanging around, someone named Steve, a middle-aged, chubby, bearded man who was offering work on a pot farm near Lake Tahoe. One of the first unusual disappearances involved a 26-year-old woman by the name of Cheryl Okoro. She was 5'1", had blue eyes and dark hair. She sometimes made money as a sex worker, but recently she had floated the idea of working on a pot farm to a relative she remained in contact with. Her sometimes boyfriend, sometimes pimp, John Lacey, was also interested in the idea, and the pair left, never to be heard from again. A short time later, their landlord would receive a letter letting them know that they weren't coming back, and that was the last time anyone ever heard from the pair again. 37-year-old Maurice Rock, another tenant in the building, also told friends he was going to be taking a job on a pot farm, and he was thinking about taking it because he really just needed to get out of the city and out into the fresh air. A couple months after Maurice went missing, another man, 35-year-old Vietnam vet Randy Vern Jacobson, also went missing, and a few days afterward, someone showed up to clean out his apartment. He also was never seen again, though the last time somebody would talk to him, he said something about heading out to work for a guy named Steve. End of autumn 1984. 39-year-old Paul Cosner was a private car dealer working in San Francisco. Originally from Ohio, he'd been living in California for almost 2 decades now and was enjoying his life. He worked for himself, buying and selling cars, and he was quite successful at it. His latest deal he had set up involved meeting to sell a copper-colored 1980 Honda Prelude. On November 2nd, 1984, he left his home before 6 p.m., telling his girlfriend Marilyn Namba that he was going to close the deal and he'd be back later that evening. He never returned. The next morning, Marilyn called Paul's sister Sharon, and she went to police, but was informed that they would have to wait at least 24 hours before they could file a missing persons report. For the next 7 months, Sharon paid all of Paul's bills on his place, just keeping it ready for him when he finally came back from wherever he had gone, but eventually, she realized he wasn't coming back. September 1984. Right around the same time people are disappearing from the Pink Palace, Charlie Ng gets a job working for Dennis Moving as a laborer. He lied on his resume, well, at least by omission, leaving out that he'd served in prison, instead claiming he was in the military the whole time. Charlie did work hard and made $350 a week, but he just never really seemed to fit in with the rest of the crew, especially with anyone who had seniority over him. People still tried to remain jovial with him, often asking him how he was doing, only to get the response, no kill, no thrill. Another of his favorite sayings was another rhyme, Daddy dies, Mama cries, Baby fries. 4 months would pass and Charlie seemed to be getting along with people a little better, including a supervisor, 24-year-old Clifford Raymond Parenteau. Cliff had always been professional with Charlie, but he still was a bit surprised when Charlie invited him out to a weekend trip to Lake Tahoe. Cliff was interested, but he did have to work that weekend, so he was afraid that he just couldn't make it. Instead, Cliff went out with another coworker that Friday night and later dropped his friend off at home before calling out "see you tomorrow" because they were going to be working together that weekend. Cliff was a no-show at work the following day. Coworkers went to his house to check in on him, and though his motorcycle was there, a blue Suzuki, Cliff wasn't. They then went and did the job and checked again afterwards, only to find Cliff still gone, and this time, so was his motorcycle. Cliff was also a no-show at a friend's Super Bowl party that Sunday, though he did win the office pool, an amount of $400, and still, nobody could reach him. A few days later, the owner of the moving company, Dennis Goza, would get a letter supposedly from Cliff that informed Dennis of Cliff's new address and asked that his remaining check be forwarded there. It also mentioned a new job, a new place, and a new girlfriend, and not questioning the letter's authenticity, Dennis simply mailed the check, sad to see Cliff go. A few days later, another letter was sent bearing Cliff's signature, this one asking a coworker to mail him his winnings from the party. Cliff was officially gone. February 24th, 1985. Jeff Gerald was another employee at Dennis Moving and had agreed to help out Charlie with a side job. He had been promised $100 to help Charlie on a freelance move, and since he was saving up for college, he decided he just couldn't pass up that much money. Plus, his band, Crash and Burn, was trying to record some songs too, and well, that also cost money, so why not? He did think Charlie was creepy, thought he was too much into the military stuff, the guns and the killing, but hey, $100 is $100. Charlie had been mad at him at one point. Jeff had left the company for a short while, and when he returned, he was reinstated with his same seniority, something Charlie thought was unfair, but they had apparently reconciled, and Jeff was ready to bury the hatchet permanently. After receiving a call from Charlie, one witnessed by his roommate, Jeff left his apartment to meet the man, telling his roommate that he'd pick up some dinner on his way back, probably Chinese or something else. 3 days later, after not hearing from Jeff, his roommate got home one evening to find that all of Jeff's stuff was gone. She never saw him again. April 14th, 1985. 18-year-old Kathleen, or Kathy Allen, was at work at the Safeway grocery store in Milpitas, California, when she finally got a phone call. It had been almost 48 hours since she had last seen her boyfriend, 23-year-old Mike Carroll, their last goodbye having been at their shared room at the Best Inn in Milpitas. Kathy had been living in the hotel for a month with Mike, and it was her first time ever being out on her own. The middle child of 3, she had been raised mostly by her mother, Sumiko, a Japanese immigrant. Her father had been in the US Navy but had passed away when she was only 6 years old in 1973. Her parents had met and fallen in love when her father was stationed in Japan, and their marriage had infuriated Sumiko's parents, who disowned her because of it. And maybe her own relationship with her mother was strained right now, but Kathy was trying to live her life just like her mother had before her. She loved Mike even though sometimes she didn't agree with him, but that was normal for any relationship. She did want to know where he had been going lately, wanted to know he was being safe, but Mike, well, he had his secrets and she didn't want to push too hard. This last trip, like the rest, Mike had told her he was going to San Francisco to see his old army buddy named Charlie. She suspected that they were up to something because every time Mike got back from hanging out with his army buddy, he somehow had a pocket full of cash that he definitely didn't have prior to leaving. He never told her what they were really doing, just that it was easy money, but Kathy had heard from another friend of Mike's that he thought they were mugging gay men in San Francisco's Castro district. Kathy would ask Mike not to go, but every time he told her to just relax and not worry about it. He'd be fine. But this time, it was different. Mike was supposed to have been back that same night, but days later he was still gone, and what was more, she hadn't even heard a word about how he was doing. Well, until now, but it wasn't Mike's voice she heard coming over the line. Instead, a soft-spoken man told her that Mike had been shot and that he needed Kathy to come and see him. The voice continued, quote, "We don't know much yet, but something went wrong. We don't know if he's going to make it. We'll send a car around for you. What time do you get off work?" End quote. Kathy told the caller she would be off by 6 and then tried to ask who was calling, only to get the answer of old friends. She was told to expect a copper-colored Honda that would be picking her up, and then the caller simply hung up on her. Confiding in some of her fellow store employees, they tried to talk sense into her, they begged her not to go, but Kathy just couldn't be talked out of it. She finally called a close friend of hers, James Bio, who agreed with her coworkers that she should not go, but he too failed to change Kathy's mind. After hanging up on her, he called her back a little while later to try once again to convince her not to go, to maybe even call the police, and Kathy answered, only to tell James that she couldn't really talk because the guy was outside waiting to take her to Mike. Then whispering into the phone, Kathy said, quote, "This guy is kind of weird. He claims to be some kind of photographer and wants to take pictures of me," end quote. James pleaded with her one final time, but when Kathy wouldn't budge, he simply ended the call stating, quote, "Call me as soon as you get to Tahoe. I want to be sure that you're okay," end quote. It was the last time they would ever talk. It was a nearly 3-hour drive out to the place, and when they finally arrived, Kathy was greeted by another man, a shorter Asian man who Kathy had met once before. It was Charlie. But instead of being relieved to at least see a slightly familiar face, Kathy became even more scared when she saw that Charlie had a gun tucked into his waistband. She was grabbed then, handcuffed, and dragged inside the nearby house. She was taken to a room with a camera mounted on a tripod, pointing at a chair in front of a backdrop, one of those fall scene backdrops that used to be in every mall portrait studio in the 80s. She was forced to sit in the chair, and almost immediately, the first man, the one who had picked her up, began messing with the video camera. When he was finally done with adjusting the camera, he turned it on and began to tell Kathy of a debt Mike owed them before telling her, quote, "You can go along with us, you can cooperate, you can do everything we tell you to do willingly, and in approximately 30 days, if you want a date to write on your calendar, the 15th of May, we'll either drug you, blindfold you in some way, or make sure you don't know where you are, and we're going to take you back to the city and let you go. And what you say at that time, I don't care. My name, you don't know. His name's Charlie, but screw it. You don't know where you are, and what you say, hopefully, can't hurt us. By then, hopefully, Mike will have disappeared gracefully. If you don't cooperate with us, if you don't agree this evening, we'll probably put a round in your head and take you out and bury you in the same area that we buried Mike. We do this just because we admit it, scared, nervous. We never planned on up, much less getting caught. And we're not intending getting caught. It's the old no witnesses. It's a little crude, but, that's where it's at." End quote. Kathy was in shock. Maybe she had noticed and maybe she hadn't, but Leonard had contradicted himself, stating they would let her go, but then ending his first part of the spiel by saying they could leave no witnesses. Leonard then continued, outlining what they needed from Kathy in order for it all to look like Mike, as well as her, simply ran away. They needed info on accounts and institutions they could write letters to in order to funnel all of Mike's money and whatever else he had into their own greedy pockets. And like they had done with the Dubs family as well as Paul Costner, they simply wanted to put up a smokescreen, something that would not eventually come back to them. Then they finally got to the part that Kathy was most likely dreading the entire time. Leonard started talking about what they wanted from her, physically. Quote, "While you are here, we'll keep you busy. You'll wash for us, you'll clean for us, cook for us, you'll for us. That's your choice in a nutshell. It's not much of a choice unless you've got a death wish. In the past 24 hours, we've been tired, nervous, a little high-strung perhaps. We expect you to do something about that. Believe me, we both need it. If you go along with us, cooperate with us, we'll be as nice as we can to you within the limits of keeping you prisoner. If you don't go along with us, we'll probably take you to the bed, tie you down, rape you, shoot you, and bury you." End quote. Kathy didn't say anything, didn't even move. After a few moments, Leonard appeared in the frame of the camera and could be heard saying, quote, "Sorry, lady, time's up. Make your choice." End quote. Kathy finally spoke. Quote, "I guess I have to be available." End quote. Getting angry at the response, Leonard yelled, quote, "Spell it out on tape. I want to hear it from your own lips." End quote. Kathy replied with, quote, "I can't spell it out. I'll go along with whatever you want." End quote. Charlie was smiling now, watching Kathy break, and he finally broke his silence by stating, quote, "Undress for us. Let's see what we bought." End quote. She undressed for them, felt their eyes wandering all over her body as she shivered in disgust and embarrassment. She was cooperating, though under threat of death, and after undressing, Kathy was made to shower with Charlie because it was something that he liked. They then spent that evening sexually assaulting Kathy while they documented the entire thing with photos as well as videos. The next day, they forced Kathy to call her boss and excuse her absence. She told her manager that she was heading to Lake Tahoe with her boyfriend, who had just found a job there, and she wanted to use her annual leave as well as taking some time off without pay. It would be a month in total, and surprisingly, her boss allowed it with no questions asked. Over the next few days, Kathy's captivity continued, and so did the abuse. Leonard continued to document it all, even against Charlie's better judgment. He was concerned that it was just too much evidence, but Leonard wouldn't budge, saying things like, quote, "Do you know how much a snuff film is worth?" End quote. He even took Kathy outside on a few occasions for more photographs, and he didn't even care that Kathy looked hopeless and dejected as she just stood there for his little sessions. Other photos of Kathy showed the room she was kept in, a room with lime green walls that gave the photos a strange green tint. There were also the bed and the bed frame, with visible eye hooks screwed in so that their victims could be tied down if needed. More days would then pass, and though she had been cooperative in the beginning, Kathy probably began to realize that the longer this went on, her chances of surviving became smaller and smaller. She tried to escape more than once, and one attempt saw her nearly get all of her restraints off, but before she could, she was discovered, and security was tightened down. Continuing their grift, the pair went back to San Jose area where Mike had a car, and they were going to try and sell it, but the 1974 Mercury Capri wasn't even really worth its weight in scrap metal. Turns out, Mike was broke, and the only thing of worth he had going on in his life was his relationship with Kathy. Kathy was still being held, and after being asked to write a letter to her boss and inform him she was quitting her job, she realized that she was never going home. That night, she tried to break out of her room. She threw her body over and over into the door, but it held, though just barely. The next morning, Leonard could see that the hinges were warped and barely hanging on to the doorframe. He felt a jolt of fear then, realizing just how close she had come to actually getting out. Leonard then tied up Kathy and took more pictures, all the while telling her about his cyanide pills he had made for himself, pills that he was more than willing to use on himself in order to not be taken alive. So, if he was willing to kill himself in order to not get arrested, imagine what he would be willing to do to her to prevent the same thing. When he was done taking photos, he agreed to let Kathy have a smoke, something Leonard detested, but knowing it was going to be her last one, he obliged. He'd have Charlie take care of her as soon as she was done. April 20th, 1985. 18-year-old Brenda O'Connor and 26-year-old Scott Stapley were driving north up Highway 99 from sunny San Diego. They had begun their drive at night, first because it would be a lot less hot, and second so that Brenda's son Lonnie Bond Jr. might be able to sleep during the almost 9-hour trip. Scott, a friend of Lonnie Sr., Brenda's boyfriend, had offered to drive the mother and baby up north to Wilseyville, where Lonnie Sr. was staying. He'd been doing his friend a favor, plus he wanted to get up north anyways, where he liked to hunt and fish, as he was an avid outdoorsman. He was growing tired of the city life, tired of the same poverty and crime he'd been trying to clean up by founding a chapter of the Guardian Angels, a volunteer group whose focus was on unarmed crime prevention. Scott was getting tired of always trying to help only to be ridiculed, and he felt that despite his efforts to clean things up, everything was only getting worse. He enjoyed getting out of town, enjoyed visiting his friend's cabin up north, and liked the peace that came with it. The only downside was the neighbors, men who he had bought a handgun off of once, a 9mm Walther PPKS. He'd liked the gun, but not the men who he found strange. A bearded guy and a shorter Asian guy, they seemed like, well, they just seemed off in how they talked and acted, but hey, no place was perfect. Brenda disliked the men too. The one man, who had given his name as Charles Gunner, was always trying to flirt with her, and no matter how many times she refused his advances, he always seemed to bounce right back. It even got to the point where she would only refer to him as face, though only when he was out of earshot. And the man seemed to be even more aggressive lately, especially since Lonnie had been working more as he did roofing jobs in order to save up some money in order to do his real passion, cooking meth. He had big dreams for his lab, wanted to make as much as possible, wanted to even become the, quote, Crystal King of California, end quote. Brenda wanted that for Lonnie, wanted to help him, but after seeing something one evening while home alone, she had decided to leave Wilseyville for somewhere she felt safer. Brenda had watched through a window as the neighbors had pushed a wheelbarrow, one that looked like it was loaded down with an actual body, out to the tree line. She was even sure she had seen the shadow of an arm hanging over the side of the wheelbarrow, and after that experience, she had gone back to San Diego. Lonnie then called her a few weeks later and begged for her to come back, and she finally agreed when Scott had volunteered to head up as well. He was a big guy, and between him and Lonnie, she felt a whole lot safer. She'd heard about the time someone had tried to mug Scott, a man who was wielding a knife, and despite the weapon, Scott had actually ended up crippling his assailant. She didn't know how long Scott would be sticking around because he'd just gotten accepted into a graduate program at San Diego State University, but hopefully it would be long enough for her to begin to feel comfortable again. They arrived in the early dawn hours and immediately went inside to take a nap before the heat of the day got too bad. Brenda woke up from her nap and decided to run into town in order to grab a few items that she needed. Before she left, Lonnie told her that dinner was already taken care of. In fact, their neighbors had actually invited them over in order to get to know them better, as well as bury the hatchet for some of the small spats they'd have, especially over leaving the gates open to their shared driveway. They just wanted to be friendly neighbors, and Brenda reluctantly agreed. Maybe it was all just a big misunderstanding. Maybe she had only assumed the worst and there was a logical explanation for everything she had saw, including the wheelbarrow. She agreed to go. Brenda returned to the cabin that afternoon, but strangely there was no sign of Lonnie Jr., or Scott. The cabin was quiet. A loud crash came from behind Brenda as her two neighbors burst through the door before grabbing her. They threw her on the ground, handcuffed her, and then half carried, half dragged her to their nearby cabin. She pled with her captors, asked them about her baby, and begged for them to just let everyone go. She then asked why they were doing all of this, only to hear the reply, quote, "'Cause we hate you," end quote. When asked why, she was only told to shut up. It wasn't supposed to go down that way. Leonard and Charlie had snuck into the house while the two men and baby slept and had tried to jump them, but Scott wasn't having it. Using his large frame, he was able to get some separation from the two men, and running towards his suitcase where his gun was, Charlie shot him with a stream of bullets. When the large man finally went down, Charlie ran over before shooting Scott in the head twice. Lonnie was much easier to subdue, and Leonard tried to question him about a rumored stash of cash he supposedly had nearby, but Lonnie told him he had no idea what he was talking about. Meanwhile, Lonnie Jr. was screaming from a nearby crib, and annoyed by the noise, Leonard handed Charlie a hammer before telling him to go take care of it. Charlie balked at first, asking if it wouldn't be better to sell the baby, at least make some money off of it, but Leonard told him no. After a brief back and forth, Charlie lost the argument and walked into the room where the baby was sleeping. Now the pair had Brenda, and she, like the baby, just wouldn't shut up no matter what Leonard said to her. She wouldn't shut up about Lonnie Jr. begging for any news of him, only to be told that he'd been given away to a nice family down in Fresno. Brenda begged some more, begged for her life and her child's, but after a while Leonard was sick of hearing it, and so, like he'd done with Kathy Allen before her, he gave Brenda an ultimatum. Either become our willing slave, or die. Brenda agreed to cooperate. Mother's Day then came and went, and Scott Stapley's mother Lola was surprised that she didn't get a card from her son. He had told her he was heading up to the mountains for a while, but this just wasn't like him. Then May 26 came, her husband's birthday, and when Scott missed that as well, she knew something was wrong. She wanted to contact authorities, almost did, but she also didn't want to be a bother, didn't want to call them only to learn Scott was still in the middle of the woods, alive and well, just incommunicado. Meanwhile, Brenda's mother was also starting to worry, and when her own birthday came and went on July 25th with no word, she also knew something was terribly wrong. Tori Doolin, Scott's girlfriend, was surprised when Leonard, going by Charles, showed up on her doorstep unannounced. She had met the man once before, up at Lonnie's cabin, but she wondered just why in the hell he was there. Well, he had some news about Scott and how he, Charles, had been the one to discover him deceased. Apparently, it wasn't just Scott either. The man, Charles, claimed to have found Lonnie and Brenda dead as well inside of Lonnie's A-frame cabin on April 22nd. He then claimed to have burned the place down to hide the evidence of a meth operation, and he told her that before they had lit the place on fire, they had noticed that all their money, IDs, and guns had already been taken by whoever had killed them. He also said that Lonnie Jr., the baby, was missing as well. He informed her he knew the murders were drug-related then and asked for her help to keep the police away to save Scott's reputation. All he needed from her were Scott's clothes, his motorcycle, the receipt for the gun Scott had bought from him, and the receipt for Scott's Chevy pickup. Tori handed over everything of Scott's then, even the key to his safe, but she couldn't find either of the receipts the man had asked for. He grew angry then and commanded her to get in contact with him later if she were to ever come across them. Tori never called the police. When Lonnie Sr. failed to pay rent that month, the property manager went out to the cabin to find it deserted. Leonard then told them that the people living there had moved, and the place was then cleaned out, cleaned up, and back on the market in no time. And that is going to be it for part 2 of our tale of the case of Charles Cheetah Ng and Leonard Thomas Lake. And even though it seems like so far the pair has basically been able to do whatever they wanted, soon reality will try and catch up, and small mistakes begin to compound into a cascade of events that will quickly spiral out of control. Join us next week as we continue the case, and don't forget to follow us on Instagram at AlmostFictionPod, where I'll be adding a whole new facet of content that I'm sure you all will love. I'm also available on Cameo, where you can search for Chase Ellerman, and if you want to buy me a green tea, a beverage vital for my research, then you can do that as well over at coffee.com/Chase Ellerman. That's ko-fi.com/Chase Ellerman. Thank you everyone so far who has supported, including our newest beverage suppliers, Kate, Emily, Sponda, April, Jess H, and Katie M. Thank you for stocking the fridge for this heavy series. Also, remember to follow us on Facebook, and if you don't have social media, but you want to stay up to date on all things Almost Fiction, including merch drops, meetups, and more, you can email me at almostfictionpod@gmail.com, where I can add you to the list so you never miss out. Once again, that's almostfictionpod@gmail.com. If you can't support right now, it's really just as important to rate and review the show so that it shows up higher on any search features. Also, please tell your friends and coworkers, as that's some of the most important work you can do for any creator. Thank you all for listening. Stay safe, stay curious, and remember, sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction.